Well, hello and welcome back to my Becoming You series. If you've been following this series from the beginning, we have travelled quite a long way together. And today, rather than introducing another chapter, I want to reflect on the journey itself. Because we've reached the epilogue of my forthcoming book, Becoming You, soon to be published. And perhaps the most important thing I want to say at the end is this. Becoming You was never really about becoming someone new. It was about gradually finding your way back to the person who was there all along. So much of therapy and personal development begins with the assumption that there is something about us that needs fixing. We arrive saying, I need to stop being anxious. I need to be more confident. I need to stop people pleasing. I need to stop overthinking. I need to be stronger. I need to be different. And I understand that. Most of us begin this journey because something hurts. But one of the central ideas running through the series of Becoming You is that underneath many of these difficulties lies something deeper, the relationship you have developed with yourself. Somewhere along the way, many of us have learned to abandon ourselves emotionally. We learn to mistrust what we felt. We learn to criticize ourselves before somebody else could criticize us. We learn to adapt, to please, to perform, to achieve, to keep the peace, or simply to become the person we needed to be in order to feel safe and accepted. And eventually we can become so good at being that person that we forget there was ever another version of us underneath. That is why I developed the idea of the filial psyche. Within us is an inner child who feels, an inner critic who tries to protect us, often through fear and criticism, and an inner nurturing parent who has the capacity to listen, reassure, guide, protect, and when necessary, challenge us. Much of our emotional suffering develops when the inner child and the inner critic become caught in an old repetitive relationship. The child becomes frightened, ashamed, lonely or uncertain, and rather than receiving reassurance, the inner critic responds with something like, "What is wrong with you? Stop being weak. You should be able to cope. You're not good enough. They're going to leave you." And so the very part of us that is frightened becomes frightened of ourselves as well. Healing begins when another voice starts to appear. The inner nurturing parent begins to say, I can see that you're frightened. I can see that this hurts. You don't have to hide it from me. I'm here. We'll work out what to do together. That might sound simple, but I believe it represents one of the profound changes that can happen through good therapy. You stop being merely the person experiencing your emotions and gradually become the person capable of caring for the part of you experiencing them. And that changes things. You begin listening to yourself instead of automatically overriding yourself. You begin trusting your feelings without necessarily allowing every feeling to dictate your behavior. You become more accepting of yourself. Your inner critic becomes something you can understand rather than simply obey. You develop self-compassion without abandoning personal responsibility. You begin creating boundaries. You discover your values. You become safer inside yourself. And eventually, something rather beautiful happens. Life stops being organized entirely around avoiding pain, rejection, failure, or abandonment, and begins to be organized around something much more interesting, being alive. That is why the final chapters of Becoming You move beyond healing, because healing is not supposed to become a lifelong project in which we spend every day examining ourselves. At some point, we have to live. We have to love people, take risks, say what we really think, allow ourselves to be seen, make mistakes, change direction, leave things that no longer fit us, move towards things that do, and perhaps sometimes disappoint people because we are no longer willing to disappoint ourselves. Now that for me is what Becoming You ultimately means. Not arriving at some perfected version of yourself, not becoming endlessly calm, confident, or emotionally invulnerable. It means developing a sufficiently secure relationship with yourself that you can meet life as yourself. And if you've watched this series and recognized yourself in some of what I've been describing, you may also have discovered something else. Understanding the pattern and changing the pattern are not always the same thing. You can understand perfectly well why you people please and still find yourself saying yes when you desperately want to say no. You can understand your abandonment fears and still feel overwhelmed when somebody becomes distant. You can know that your inner critic is frightened and still finds its voice incredibly persuasive. Sometimes we need another person alongside us while we learn to do something differently. That fundamentally is what I believe therapy can offer. My role as a therapist is not to tell you who you should become. It is certainly not to turn you into a version of me. My job is to become curious with you about the person underneath the adaptations, the fear, the expectations, and the old beliefs, to help you recognize the voice of your inner child, to understand rather than simply fight your inner critic, and to strengthen your inner nurturing parent until increasingly you can provide for yourself what you may have once have spent your life trying to obtain from everybody else. So if you've been watching these videos and thinking, this is me, or I understand what Steve is talking about, but I don't quite know how to change it, you are very welcome to contact me. I work as a psychotherapist and identity coach, and much of my work focuses on precisely these issues: identity, self-worth, people-pleasing, relationship patterns, abandonment fears, anxiety, the inner critic, the inner child work, and those periods in life when the person you have been no longer seems to fit the life you are living. You do not need to have everything worked out before contacting a therapist. In fact, I know something needs to change, but I don't know what, is a perfectly reasonable place to begin. You can contact me through the details accompanying this video, and we can have an initial conversation about what is happening in your life, what you would like to change, and whether working together feels right for you. There is no requirement to arrive with the right words. There's no examination to pass. Therapy begins with wherever you actually are. And perhaps that is an appropriate place to end this series, because becoming you was never intended to give you 14 more things to achieve. It was intended to invite you into a different relationship with yourself, a relationship in which the inner child no longer has to shout quite so loudly because somebody is finally listening, in which the inner critic no longer has to control everything because somebody more capable has begun taking responsibility, and in which the inner nurturing parent can increasingly say, whatever happens next, I'm not going to abandon you. If there's one idea I would like you to take away from this entire journey, it is this: you do not find yourself by becoming more acceptable to everybody else. You find yourself by becoming someone you are no longer prepared to abandon. And then, perhaps for the first time, life begins to feel less like something you have to survive, manage, or get right, and more like something you are finally free to inhabit. The image I've chosen for the final pages of Becoming You is a path leading home. Along the path are some of the things we have gradually learned to put down: the old burdens, the chains, the masks, the beliefs about who we thought we had to be. And at the end of that path is a home with its door open and a light burning. There is nobody standing at the door waiting to let you in, because it was always your home. So perhaps there are only two words needed at the end of this journey: welcome home.